right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio on Chaos 95.9 FM in Austin, Texas. Of course, we're streaming live worldwide on the internet at chaosradioaustin.org and at antiwar.com/radio. And it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Engelhardt. He runs TomDispatch.com, writes for us regularly at antiwar.com/Engelhardt. He's a publisher for 25 years. He's the author of The End of Victory Culture, The World According to Tom Dispatch, and Mission Unaccomplished, a fellow of the Nation Institute. And again, the website is TomDispatch.com. Welcome back to the show, Tom. How are you doing?
Thanks, Scott. I'm okay, getting by here.
That's good to know. Now, listen, I've been trying my very best to keep track of this Afghan war, and I read, article before last of yours up here in the archives at antiwar.com, the 9 surges of Obama's war. And I thought, man, I must have lost count in there somewhere. I didn't realize there was 9 of them. Tom, why don't you help take us through? We know that in March of 2009, he signed an order or whatever to let Gates put another 20,000 American troops there, and now he's just announced another 34,000 on their way over there to the AFPAC region, as they call it now. But still, that's 1, 2, skip a few. What am I missing here?
Okay, well, before we even get to the other 6, 7, or 8, just starting with the troop surge, the first thing to know, because one of the things is we've focused on Obama's recent decision to send 30,000 more troops as if it were the decision, the crucial moment, the main moment. In fact, the surge, however you define it, has really been going on since the last days of the Bush administration. The first 11,000 troops of the surge, before Obama in March sent in 21,000, there were 11,000 troops that went in the early days of the Obama administration that had actually been approved by the Bush administration, which probably means actually by Robert Gates. So in a way, you could already think of this as Gates's war and Gates's surge. So you really have a process that's been going on for a year now, let's say. The surge is not something that started in March. It's not something that really just started when the president gave a speech at West Point. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we think of the surge only in terms of troops, but it's actually a much broader phenomenon. I mean, it's bigger. Our surge is much larger than we imagine because we don't put all the different things that are surging together. So, for instance, there's a contractor surge. These private contractors that basically the Pentagon hires, the State Department hires them too, that do a lot of stuff that once was military. So they drive the supply trucks. Sometimes they're guarding bases or they're policing on bases. They do KP. They deliver the mail. They do the meals and various other things. Between June and September, the number of contractors in Iraq rose by 40%. I mean, that's a surge in itself. Now, a lot of those are local Afghans hired by these companies. They're out of the...
What percentage of those are mercenaries? Do you know?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the problem is I don't even know. There's no way to know. And the figure we have is there are now about 104,000 private contractors, hired private contractors in Iraq. And that is more than the number of troops that will be there, U.S. troops, when the surge reaches its height in 7 or 8 or 9 months. But what they're all doing, we don't know. Some of them are armed Afghans. Some of them are armed Americans. There are about 10,000, a little less than 10,000 Americans. There are another maybe 16,000 third world nationals. That's the category that the Pentagon uses anyway, people not Afghan, and then there are 70-odd thousand Afghans among this. So that's a surge. You have a civilian surge. The State Department will, by this January, have tripled the number of its people in Afghanistan since last January. So that's a surge. They're sending in new, diplomats, agricultural experts, et cetera. And by the way, they're doing the same thing in Pakistan. So there's a double civilian surge there. There's a CIA and special ops surge. And that's mostly across the border. The CIA part of it is probably mostly across the border in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. They evidently, again, we know less about this, but we do know they're sending out more. The CIA runs the drone program in Pakistan, that missiles and bombs in the tribal border.
Well, let me elaborate for a second there while you take a sip of water. Okay. I'd like to mention, for the sake of argument here, Jeremy Scahill's recent great work at The Nation magazine on this, and there's a great interview of him on Democracy Now! As well, talking about Blackwater working with the CIA inside Pakistan. It's a continually developing story, and we're trying to get a hold of Jeremy Scahill to get him on the show to help fill out the details there. But looks like the Washington Post and the New York Times are now playing catch-up to Jeremy Scahill on this very issue, right?
It's absolutely true, and he just had one of his latest pieces. He mentions that in addition to the CIA over there, that the Joint Special Operations Command, which is the kind of special ops command, that McChrystal, our war commander there, once ran in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're the guys who go out and, snatch Taliban and Al-Qaeda types. They usually have assassination programs and so on. They have a program in Pakistan coming out of Karachi, in connection with Blackwater, which renamed itself Z. That's another probably little part of the surge.
Well, and it's important to note, I think, isn't it, that the Joint Special Operations Command has gotten more and more of what would usually, I guess, be the CIA's authority, because they don't have to answer to the intelligence committees. They don't need a presidential finding authorizing them to break the law. They just do whatever they want.
That's right. I think that's true. And you've got a training surge. We're upping our massively attempting to massively up our training program for the Afghan and army and police. This is something that's talked about quite separately, but not exactly thought of as a surge. And with all this, you've got an enormous surge in costs. I mean, the president's been saying $30 billion for the. That was in his West Point speech. To get the extra troops there and so on for a year. His estimate in that speech is $30 billion. That's way under. I mean, they're now talking about. We've already spent between the Afghan police and army at least $25 billion in training and mentoring. I mean, to produce a kind of disaster. And obviously, if you're going to send in 10,000 more people or so to train up the Afghan security forces, you're talking about another enormous cost. And when that $30 billion can't include, for instance, there's been another kind of surge that's been going on in this period, has been a base buildup. The Pentagon's been building bases all over southern Afghanistan and elsewhere too. And it's been building up the bases it has. It's got the big base at Bagram Air Force Base, the old Russian site. It's got a base in Kandahar, another Russian site actually, from the war in the 80s. And both of those, it's expanding significantly.
It's interesting to me, Tom, that a lot of the criticism of the surge has pointed out that, for example, Patrick Coburn in his piece over at Counterpunch the other day was saying, listen, the whole Iraqi surge being a success was a myth in the first place. So now if your entire goal is to recreate that myth in Afghanistan, you're up against a major problem. And I think, for somebody like me who's not a real expert, I can still tell just right off the bat that in Iraq we were installing the majority who ultimately doesn't need us. Here we're installing the Hazaras and the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and attempting to set them up to dominate the Pashtuns. And I guess the Pashtuns are not the majority, but they're certainly a pretty darn big minority. They may even be the plurality of a certain certain ethnicity inside Afghanistan.
Usually the estimates is given is that the Pashtuns make up about 42%.
Oh yeah, so they're by far the plurality there, and yet we're just putting, as Gareth Porter was reporting last week, we're just putting the Tajiks in charge of the army and basically, staying with all the lines of the old civil war between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. Even though Karzai himself is a Pashtun, he doesn't seem to have much in common with the tribesmen that we're bombing.
I guess what I'd say is that, you've got two things at once. On the one hand, and the point I guess I was trying to make in that 9 surges piece, you've got a much larger operation. You've got the surge is a much larger thing than Americans have been told, than has been explained to Americans, than Americans think. And on the other hand, it's likely to be much smaller than what would theoretically be necessary, to, do whatever the Bush administration, now the Obama administration, actually wants to do in Afghanistan. So the answer is, we don't know. I mean, the future's always unknown, but it's a reasonable guess that this will not work particularly well. It may work fairly brutally, but not particularly well.
Well, and even in Iraq, it didn't work well. We just helped one side finish the civil war against the other side that they were almost done winning by then anyway.
And you had other factors in Iraq that were I mean the sectarian war had reached its height. Baghdad had been largely ethnically cleansed of Sunnis in a lot of its key neighborhoods, and you had in Anbar province in particular, you had this what became to be called the Sunni Awakening movement, which was really a movement against the Al Qaeda in Iraq group. It was really a movement that started quite separately from the American surge. Probably the smartest thing that General Petraeus did in purely technical terms. And it's something we're often good at, is he threw money at that, paying for friendship, bribery, and so on and so forth. We have historically been pretty good at that. It's one of the things that we've been most skilled at. And in this case, it was probably the key thing in what happened, rather than the literal surge in troops itself.
Yeah. Well, and of course, if you go back and check all the reporting, the nominally Sunni insurgency had tried to cut that same deal with the Americans in the summer of 2003, 2004, 2005, and 2006. Finally, Petraeus took them up on it. But I guess the parallel in Afghanistan would be if McChrystal was to bribe all the Taliban to fight against assuming we can believe that there's a single Arab anywhere in that country, call them Al-Qaeda and fight against them. That would be the parallel if we were to make it. But that's not what we're doing. We're paying the Tajiks and the Uzbeks to fight against the Pashtuns, right?
Looked at another way, if the figures being used by, top American officials for Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan are correct, which is that there are approximately 100 operatives or fighters somewhere in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda. And, in fact, there may be less. If you think of it this way, and if it turns out that the Afghan war in the end comes close to being in itself over many years a $1 trillion war, I mean, can you imagine, this is like Osama bin Laden's, this would be like Osama bin Laden's dream, to hold down American power, make it spend $1 trillion for a few scattered fighters. It's a remarkable story thought of that way. Mm-hmm. Story of folly.
Well, since you brought that up, let me ask you what you think about this. I always just sort of assumed, not too strongly, but I guess my default position, Tom, was that if Osama bin Laden died, then Ayman al-Zawahiri and all the rest of those guys would put out videos with them, shooting off streamers and firing guns in the air and celebrating and laughing at us and saying, ha ha, our great hero died and you people were never able to get a hold of him. And yet, as Phil Giraldi wrote for his article last week on antiwar.com, it's getting harder and harder to believe that this guy is just holed up in those mountains somewhere and has been all this time. It seemed plausible enough for a few years there, but we're starting to get to the point where not just kooks, but reasonable people are asking whether Osama bin Laden is even still alive on this earth at all. What do you think about that?
I have no opinion on this, because how can anybody know? Anything could be true. He could be in Bolivia or waiting on tables in Soho in London. Honestly,
I think he's in the Four Seasons in Washington, D.C.
I honestly don't. Literally, all we know is that as far as we know, nobody we know has spotted him in years.
Well, let's escalate the war then.
Yeah. So, but but this whole thing, the cost. This is, I suppose, what I was getting at in that piece. That the costs of this war are what will break us. It won't be, it won't be casualties, because even if casualties rise, they have. They still, in comparison with, I don't know, you can compare it to anything, traffic accidents, deaths from cigarettes or whatever it might be. Compared to Vietnam, compared to whatever, relatively speaking, if you aren't a member of a certain community and a certain family and so on and so forth, these are relatively small-scale casualties in terms of what a great power theoretically can take. But the real drain No, I mean, I'm not talking about emotionally, and I'm not talking. The real drain is the drain on our monies. I mean, this is staggering sums of money to be fighting a war halfway around the world when what was at stake was, our so-called Defense Department actually playing defense and somebody locking some doors on plane cabins. I mean, very little was really at stake here. And I think the dangers, while they're there in the world, remain relatively modest, and yet we're in this staggering war. I mean, there are various explanations for it in addition to Osama bin Laden. I mean, the desire to be based in Afghanistan, which is obviously there, the desire to be in Central Asia, oil. I mean, there are all these different explanations, but it still staggers the imagination.
Yeah, well, what staggers my imagination is that people's imaginations were really that pliable. I mean, when September 11th happened, anybody who actually, was interested in foreign policy as a matter of course, saw it for what it was, a desperate move to try to provoke a response. That's what terrorism's for, is to try to get a reaction out of you and to try to, it's asymmetric warfare and all that. But when the war party went on TV and told the American people that this is just a portent of things to come, this is just the razor's edge, the leading vanguard of the Islamo-fascist caliphate that's bent on taking over the world, including America, converting us all, and, raping our daughters and cutting our sons' heads off, and all these things, the American people bought it. They didn't say, oh, okay, a couple of hundred people got lucky and did one big attack. They really believed the Republicans who said that, I guess the Afghanistan Air Force was going to parachute down and take over our country like Red Dawn or something.
I watched George Bush. I mean, people have forgotten this, but I watched him on television when he claimed, for instance, that Saddam Hussein was capable of sending small planes over the East Coast with that could spray, chemical, biological war. I mean, this was like there were so many scary fantasies being offered that had borne no relation to reality. Saddam Hussein had no such planes, no way of getting him off the east coast of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. But this was stuff. This was serious stuff. Senator Nelson from Florida was he was. I remember he talked about it afterwards. He had been briefed by, I forget, maybe the CIA on this, but one of the intelligence agencies on this possibility, and he said this is unbelievable. I mean, it was such a strange world, and it remains a strange world. This still remains. I mean, if you listen to Obama at West Point, he was still telling the same story. It was the story that we're familiar with from Bush. There's evil in the world. It has us in desperate danger. We have to be thousands of miles away from home, spending our fortune, in order to protect Americans from this organization that looked at realistically, even in the best of times, before it was being seriously attacked, was only capable of mounting major operations every couple of years, which had no sleeper cells in this country. This was all junk.
Yeah. I actually saw an episode of Penn and Teller, their Showtime show, Humbug, I guess you could call it, where they actually showed one of the guys that had covered his entire house with duct tape and plastic, like heavy grade plastic. He'd wrapped his entire house. He was sure that the terrorists were going to come and spray us with germs any day now, and that would keep him safe, because that's what TV said. And apparently he didn't have a single thing in his head that would say, yeah, but just because TV says something or just because some politician claims something doesn't mean you're supposed to internalize it. He didn't have a single thing in his entire brain to tell him that this is ridiculous, man. You live in Appalachia. Nobody's coming for you.
It was all over the country. There was a park, one of these kind of water parks called, I don't even remember, in Florida, called something like Witchy or something. I've forgotten the name, which was declared, locally declared to be a potential terrorist target. I mean, this happened all over the country, and this was kind of some level of it was both fantasy fear and it was money making. I mean, money was pouring into police departments for this sort of stuff. The Homeland Security Department, our second Defense Department, was building a whole constituency and a little, mini industrial complex to go with it. I mean, these things. I mean, there were interests that formed around these things and that actually promoted them strongly.
Yeah. Well, we like being scared, right? So why we go to horror movies?
Well, that's true.
It's fun in a way,
The sad thing is that so many societies. I mean, listen, I live in New York City. 9/11, it was very close to home. You know, I mean, you couldn't live in New York City and not know somebody who knew somebody who had died. I had friends whose kids were in school right there, who stepped out of school and watched people jumping out of those buildings. I mean, this was a nightmare. But so many societies have lived through worse than this. This wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't the apocalypse. It was a televisually spectacular attack, but it was not the end of anything. And the thought that we would have organized ourselves purely on this basis and headed out into the world as a kind of a crusader nation, it still strikes me as remarkable, and yet it's true. I mean, the first thing that I'm going to write about this in my next piece. I mean, this is a piece for next week because I have other people's pieces coming up at Tom Dispatch. But the first thing that started me going, a few weeks after 9/11, when the news coverage was terrible, and I had a different idea of what might happen, and somebody sent me a piece by an Afghan guy living in California. He was in exile. And there was an image in it. It was a very striking piece, which I just went back and read the other day. There was an image in it. He asked a question. The war was about to start with Afghanistan. He said, what does it mean to bomb the rubble? Because Afghanistan was already wrecked at that point. Yes, and I thought, God, that's an image you don't see. And that was the first piece I sent around in what later became Tom Dispatch. I sent it out to friends and said, you really have to read this. But when you go back and read it today, he was very anti-Taliban. He had a strong sense of who they were. He had a strong sense of who Al-Qaeda was, of what Al-Qaeda was, and thought nothing of them. But he knew the folly of going into Afghanistan. If you look back at that piece, he functionally predicted much of what happened. It was a warning against going into Afghanistan and staying there. And there were people in that first moment who knew what a catastrophe this would be. And none of them are now in Washington. None of them are in the Obama administration. None of them are advising on foreign policy. That's the irony.
Yeah, and the thing that really gets me too is that if it had been Harry Brown or even, say, Ralph Nader, somebody with, character who'd been the president at the time, if he had told the American people, don't be afraid. We're actually going to do a very limited mission. Some of you may really want to see big bombs exploding on TV, but the fact is, you can't really bomb the town of Bedrock. There's nothing there. We're looking for a few bad men, and we're going to catch them and kill them, and that's going to be the end of that. The American people would have went along with that. Instead, George Bush said, be afraid, be very afraid. Only I can lead you now, and if I don't, you'll all die. And here's what we have to do. And it was this endless list, 60 countries with Al-Qaeda people that we might have to regime change and all these things. You're with us or against us. And so the American people are a bloodthirsty lot, kind of, but it seems to me like all this rot comes from the top. That if Ralph Nader or Harry Brown had been there and said, all right, everybody, this was really sad, but we need you to be cool, and we need to, not be afraid. We need to figure out, take a limited action and put an end to it as soon as we can. The American people probably would have gone along with that too, don't you think?
I think so, actually. Yeah, I do. I mean, I honestly don't know, but yes, it's the thing that should have been done. And I do believe that I still believe this. I wrote, at Tom Dispatch, it was one piece of mine that got a lot of attention. I wrote an alternate speech for Obama. He just gave this speech in West Point. About 2 weeks before that, I wrote the speech that I knew he wouldn't give in West Point, which was a speech saying, this administration will be responsible for ending, not extending, two wars. And, I think that everybody believes here that domestically, that if as a president, particularly a Democratic president, faced with a war like this, could not go out and simply de-escalate it, that he would be political dead meat. And yet, if you look through the historical record, there's no evidence one way or the other. The only example I could really think of that was even faintly relevant was Ronald Reagan. After the disaster in Lebanon, he pulled American troops out almost immediately and suffered, in essence, nothing for that. What we do know is we at least have some evidence of what happens to a president, particularly President Johnson in the Vietnam years, who decides to escalate an inherited war like this. So I believe that even now there would have been a lot of angry people. It would have been the media would have been a kind of an echo chamber. It would have been very noisy if Obama had gone and said, no, I am basically in a sane way, at a reasonable pace, going to end this Afghan war. No more surges, no more escalations. There would have been a lot of noise and a lot of escalation, but I don't think there's any proof one way or the other, whether or not he would really suffer for that. I think it's still possible that Americans might have really felt no. We can live with this. It's an unpopular war.
Well, the thing is, though, Gareth Porter wrote a great thing about how Gates and Clinton and the generals kind of boxed Obama in on all this, and I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. But I wonder if there's any truth to the idea that he would rather do better. I mean, why should we believe that he's any better than Dick Cheney on any of these issues, really?
I
mean, he keeps acting like Dick Cheney, and we keep saying it's all Gates' fault, but, why?
No, I think I don't take him off the hook at all, personally. On the other hand, soon after he was elected, I did write a piece titled "Don't Let Barack Obama Break Your Heart." And I think he came committed to a surge strategy in Afghanistan. I think he basically said so in his election campaign. And the thing that made it easier to do, and this is where Gates comes in, is that strategy was already underway. I mean, that is, It was already just as in Iraq, his policy in Iraq is not a new policy. He simply has accepted the late Bush policy on Iraq.
Right.
Which again was Gates. I mean, this is what he's carrying out. It's not. I don't think there is in this case a striking Obama policy. There's enormous continuity, whether you call it Cheney or Bush or whatever. In these wars, there's a great deal of continuity. The reason I don't say Cheney is because I actually think that the end of the Bush second term was not a Cheney moment, and that the continuity is not quite with Cheney. So, but
it's more of a Condoleezza Rice continuity.
Yeah, I think, but nonetheless, there is real continuity, and I don't think. I mean, I won't say that Obama isn't uncomfortable, because I just tend to think as I get older that we don't know what's going on inside people, and often even when they say they do, they don't themselves. So I'm not sure whether he's uncomfortable or not, or how he's feeling about this. But if you just look at what's happening, there is continuity.
And as you said before too, I mean, he really is in the position to make the change if he wants to. I don't know if you saw Gordon Prather's article, Obama the Great. But he said, all Obama has to do to go down in history forever as Obama the Great is just give one speech and just say, it shall be the policy of the United States government and the United States Armed Forces, as long as I'm the president, that we will never bomb any safeguarded facilities. And that way to better convince every country to join the NPT and cooperate with the safeguards agreements and all those things. And it would be, it would probably be downward pressure on the price of oil immediately and all that, since the Iranians are, in fact, members in good standing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And no one can contradict him on that. The Congress can't really contradict him on that, not to effect. The State Department and the Defense Department can't contradict him. He's the president. If he says the policy is we will not bomb any nuclear facilities as long as they're safeguarded, that would be the policy, period, for 4 years.
By the way,
that's all he has to do.
On top of which I like, Gary Wills wrote a good piece about a one-term president and pointed out that, the ultimate value in life is not being reelected president of the United States. It's doing what should be done in your term.
Sure. Yeah, it doesn't sound too difficult to me. Well, and speaking of difficult, let's get back to the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Do you know of any credible, people whose opinion about these things you've come to respect over this time, who thinks that this is actually possible, that they could, carry out this strategy as they've defined it of they'll stand up, we'll stand down after, we'll train up their army and all these things? Or is this just, are they trying to destroy the place forever? What is going on here? What are the possibilities for quote unquote success, do you think, Tom?
I think success, defined even modestly, I think the possibilities are very small. I mean, on the Afghan army, they're talking about an army of 240,000, but estimates I've seen are that you could not create an army there of more than 100,000 as long as you had a desertion rate, as now, of 25 to 30%. You just can't bring enough people in and train them without losing them at desertion and non-reenlistment rate.
Well, and plus the Americans have to pay their salaries.
This is ours. I mean, this is on the theory of Colin Powell's, so-called Pottery Barn rule, which is you break it, you own it. In this case, you make it, you own it. I mean, Afghanistan is one of the poorest nations on earth. If we were capable of creating a force of 400,000, police and army people, it would be ours. We would have to pay it ad infinitum. Hamid Karzai said 15 to 20 years we'd be paying. That was just what he said the other day. I mean, and it's not even a meaningful number. I mean, that is 15 or 20 years from now. Who knows what's going to happen in Afghanistan, but there's no reason to believe that they could pay for a 400,000 man security force. The answer is, I would never say that in those Iraqi terms that it wouldn't be possible, say, to blunt this is all that they're talking about, success, to blunt the Taliban, the spread of the Taliban, to tamp down the insurgency for a while, I have no idea. I think it's unlikely, but I don't think it's inconceivable. I just think that, largely speaking, if you have done that, if you've succeeded, what exactly have you done? And why? For what purpose? All that means you're still there. The Taliban aren't going to go away. Everybody agrees on that. I mean, even the Obama administration agrees on that. They're not going away. The insurgency won't end. So you're just stuck there forever. You're spending American money there in huge quantities forever. I mean, these bases that are being built up are enormous, just as in Iraq. There are these huge permanent-looking facilities on the land. So I can't really imagine what, if we succeeded, what that would mean in any positive sense. What does succeed mean? I mean, even if it were possible, maybe it is. You never know in this life. I don't think it's meaningful. I don't think it matters.
Well, I don't think anybody questions the ability of the United States Marine Corps to put firepower on targets.
Right, exactly.
And, I've read a lot of quotes of Afghans saying, what, are you kidding me? You're sending 100,000 troops to go after 100 guys, and your Marine Corps can't find them and kill them? I mean, what are we talking about here? So I guess, I would just have to assume they haven't really been trying this whole time or something, or they just can't get to the mountainous areas where the guys are hiding out or something. I don't know. But if they really tried, I have to assume that the Marines can kill people. That part is not really in question. But the question is whether that is progress, whether that's a step toward, some, westernized, centralized, somewhat democratic nation state there in between Iran and Pakistan.
Yeah, I think this is basically inconceivable, and I don't think that'll happen. But but all of this, you just constantly have to ask the question: to what purpose? I think for any normal American purpose, for any normal American, the unless you are, as you said before, in terror of Al Qaeda and so on and so forth, unless you're living in that state of terror, you just have to ask, what is the purpose of this?
Well, let me ask you that, because I asked Patrick Coburn that, and I asked Gareth Porter that, and I ask everybody I can that would talk about the Afghan war on this show. What is this all about? Pepe Escobar says it's all about pipelines, and then other people, I forget who I'm quoting here, say, well, the Israelis are really worried about Pakistani nukes, so they're trying to get America to take Pakistan's nukes, and it's all about, what Netanyahu wants, and other people say, well, it's all just about, checking Russia and China. Of course, the Caspian Basin and gas lines in Turkmenistan, and who knows, but nobody seems to really know. A lot of people claim to know, but Gareth Porter says that no, their only goal is to kill the people who are resisting them, and they don't have any smarter thought process behind it at all.
I think you'd have to trace this historically, and you'd have to say that when the Bush administration went in, they had a very geopolitical vision of how the world worked. They wanted to roll back Russia. It was very clear. They made this clear. They thought that American military power alone, they were romantics about American military power. They believed that the threat of this powerful force, once it stopped being a threat, once it was actually applied, could actually subdue people, and that, if you remember the phrase shock and awe, that the Middle East could in essence be shocked and awed into a kind of, it was Pax Americana. They were interested in oil flows. They were interested in basing themselves on either side of Iran. They were interested in a number of geopolitical things. I think at this point, most of that, and in this sense, if that was Patrick Coburn who was saying it or whoever, I think most of that has gone. Years have passed. even if you look at Iraq right now, where we are heavily based still, and Iraq is actually giving away oil contracts. They're largely not giving them away to the American majors. This was the original. Originally the neocons were planning to privatize the Iraqi oil economy and to bring in the oil majors, particularly the American oil majors. But that hasn't, Exxon got one contract, but basically that hasn't happened. And I think a lot of this stuff has now gone by the boards. I think people are still thinking about, basing, the crucial basing places and trying to keep American troops in what they consider key areas and so on and so forth. But I think a lot of this is kind of gone, and we're just left with this damn war.
Yeah, well, and there's weapon sales, too. I saw the craziest clip.
Weapon sales, of course, yeah.
I saw this clip from CNBC where they said, all right, well, Obama's set to announce his surge, which gives us the opportunity to analyze some defense stocks. Here are our experts. What do you like, guys? And they're going, oh, well, I like Northrop Grumman. I like Lockheed. Oh, we're going to make a killing off all this killing.
There is a lot of this. There are a lot of interests. In a way, this was very overdetermined. And if you want to think about it, it wasn't when people just say oil. It can't have been just oil because there were many interests, and there still are, that have a role in all this. For instance, Afghanistan is, like all American wars, Afghanistan is now a testing ground for and Pakistan testing ground for weaponry. We're bringing online the latest drones. They finally got the ridiculous Osprey,
right.
It's not a plane, it's not a helicopter, whatever it is. They got that into use. It is a testing ground for weapon systems, for the next war, for future whatevers, and so on and so forth. So that is, all of these things are a factor, but in the end, I think something about the war itself has us in its grasp, and there may be no single overriding thing that even makes sense in terms of this.
Well, all we need is, say, 2 out of 300 million people to go out on the street and say, hell no, that's it. But they won't ever do that. And so I guess it's going to go on until the dollar is worth a nickel.
I fear so. I really do. And on that note, I have to go write my next piece.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your time on the show today, Tom.
God, this was great.
All right, everybody, that's Tom Engelhardt from TomDispatch.com. Of course, you can find him at antiwar.com/Engelhardt. Look for the 9 surges of Obama's war, and also all the other articles by the great authors that write for him at Tom Dispatch. And, of course, he writes the introductory paragraphs for so many of them, including the latest, The Dust Bowl of Babylon. Thanks again, Tom.
Okay, bye, Scott.